You're listening to episode 38 of Pass the Chipotle. I'm your host, Rocio Carvajal, food history writer, cook, and author. And on this podcast, I explore the gastronomic traditions of Mexico and bring together the voices of cooks, authors, and entrepreneurs who build cross-cultural bridges around the world, championing Mexican food. To find more information about the podcast, please go to passthechipotle.com. You can subscribe to the show and leave a review on iTunes, Player FM, Stitcher, Google Play, and YouTube.
Hi everyone, my name is Irina Maria and I'm from Escondido, California, and I love listening to Pass the Chipotle podcast, so tune in and enjoy it.
Hola and welcome back to another episode of Pass the Chipotle. And if you are tuning in for the first time, a very warm welcome. Along this show, and since the beginning of it, I have worked hard to track down and connect with people that through their work continuously add value to the way in which we understand, consume and appreciate Mexican food around the world. My guest today is a very young and incredibly passionate advocate of the farm-to-table movement, Jorge Gaviria, a former Forbes 30 under 30, who is the founder and CEO of MASIENDA. After obtaining a degree in media, culture and communication at the New York University, Jorge went on to create a farm-to-table experience in Italy that was part of the Putney students' travel programs. And this pushed him immediately to pursue one of his ultimate passions in life, which is food. And so he went to work at Maialino, which is a renowned Italian-inspired restaurant at the heart of New York. But then the opportunity came up for him to join the apprenticeship program at Dan Barber's Blue Hill at Stone Barns. You might remember Chef Barber from the first season of the docuseries Chef's Table, and if you haven't seen it, please I urge you to watch it, because you will understand why that experience prepared Jorge for working his way backwards in the food production chain after realizing that the hyper-industrialization of food production causes an increasingly worrying detachment to heritage food systems that ultimately has a profound and detrimental effect in our food system and of course in our consumption habits and health. Deeply embedded in Jorge's memory was a trip to Mexico, in which food was key to helping connect with his Mexican heritage, and it was precisely the quintessential flavor and texture of freshly made corn tortillas that later inspired him to create a company that pays tribute to these traditions, and in his words, elevates the everyday tortilla for the next generation of eaters, sustained in a farm-to-tortilla model. In this interview, Jorge shared an incredibly pertinent and much-needed analysis about the benefits of going to extreme lengths to educate partners, clients, and shareholders about the environmental, cultural, economic, and gastronomical benefits of using Mexican corn to produce and enjoy delicious corn tortillas in the US. We also talked about business building and the celebration of traditional foodways. On my website, passthechipotle.com, there is a special blog post about this episode with extra material, including videos about Masienda's work. The visual version on YouTube also has extra content that illustrates this very enticing talk about Mexico's gastronomic pillar, which is corn and of course, corn tortillas. And without further delay, I hope you enjoy this episode. Jorge, it's great to have you here. Welcome to the podcast. I have to say that I'm really enthusiastic about your business model. I think Masienda is such good news in many respects. So let's go straight to the opening question. And, in plain English, businesses become successful when they offer solutions to real problems. So by all means, tell me what is wrong with American tortillas.
Well, thanks for having me, Rocio. It's a pleasure to be with you. I think I don't want to problematize tortillas for the entire country. I think the biggest thing I saw in 2013 when I started thinking about founding Masienda was that there was just more to be desired. And as a consumer of food and one who values a really strong connection to food as a way of enhancing the experience, I just didn't feel like I had a strong connection to tortillas and the history and technique and preparation of how they're made. And I certainly didn't have a connection to the supply chain behind it. So honestly, that's the rabbit hole that I fell down. We've come a long way from the traditions that have defined the cuisine for a long time, and tortillas are no exception to that. We've taken a lot of shortcuts in the commercialization of food and the hyper-industrialization of agriculture and food. And I think that that's kind of more where I saw room for improvement. I should say that the innovation wasn't so much that we were creating something new. We could never take credit for that. I think the innovation was that we were finding new ways to think about supply chains and think about traditional foods in a modern landscape, that had kind of done away with those traditional foods and slow foods, if that makes sense.
So if I get it correct, pretty much you were trying to bring closer people to not just the final product, but actually to be more also aware of the source, of the ingredients from this product and the tradition attached to it, right?
Yeah, that's right. And I think it was really a process of discovery for myself, and one that continues to this day. When I asked myself the question in 2013, what does the supply chain of corn look like? To me, it wasn't one that was doing as best of a job as we could. And I didn't have to look very much farther than the foodways in Mexico to realize that this was a largely untouched but highly evolved way of growing food and enjoying food, particularly corn, that didn't have a place in the marketplace in a real scalable way. I think the interesting problems to me were kind of the socioeconomic problems. Masienda works on both sides of those, of the value chain. But as far as the supply chain was concerned, there were 3 million smallholder farmers, there still are, that produce the highest quality corn in the world. The unbelievable thing to me was that they were growing corn and they didn't have a market to absorb the surplus materials that they would have from year to year. And that is a discouraging process. I know that feeling. It's not an easy one to wrap your head around, especially if it's happening year over year. There's not enough income coming from the farm aspect of it. We started to look at that pattern and say, well, what happens if folks are going across the border to work in the United States and there's not enough help on the farm? Well, that means that the genetics that are on the farm are now at risk of potentially not being around for many more generations. That was really something that was compelling for me, and it spoke to exactly what I wanted to achieve with a company, which was to create an enormous amount of social and environmental and potentially even political good and nourish people at the same time at the other end of the value chain.
Well, you touched so many aspects, about migration, about the situation in the agricultural sector in Mexico, about the production chain in Mexico, about the production chain and appreciation of foods in America, but let's break it in little parts. So, beginning with corn, right? So pretty much, it has been a constant in life and these parts of the world for at least 12,000 years since its domestication. But, when you think about this type of foods or the equivalent of this type of significant and so culturally meaningful foods or ingredients in other countries, namely in America, I really don't think there is an equivalent for it for many reasons. One of them, of course, being its own history and the way it developed. Quite ironically, corn is today a really important part of the American agricultural economy. And according to the National Corn Growers Association, there are, give or take, around 90.2 million acres planted with corn in the U.S., which is roughly about 370,963 tons of corn produced a year. So what do you actually do with all that corn?
So what do we do with all that corn? We don't use that corn, I should say, but I think the last figure I read was about 98.5% of it goes to almost anything but human nutrition and nourishment. We're talking about the equivalent of butchers and being able to break down kind of a nose to tail version of, there are those industrial equivalents for corn that have done an unbelievable job at finding dynamic uses for what started out as a food product. Obviously, ethanol is a huge consideration, and a lot of corn is adapted and hybridized for the purpose of making exceptional ethanol. And that's where we've come with corn in the last 50 years. And honestly, that's what I was looking at when I was thinking about starting a company that was involved in some way in telling a better story about tortillas. That's what I was looking at as the other end of the supply chain. And I just wasn't excited about that. It's ultimately what drove me to Mexico to celebrate this, as you say, a tradition that's been around for a lot longer than it's been in the U.S. And that tradition not only has a lot more experience, it tastes a heck of a lot better, at least in my opinion.
In one way, it's a great achievement to make the most of, all the effort put behind just, growing this and then obtaining that much benefit. I guess it also speaks to how it happens in history time and time again. When something that is introduced in another context, it can have, life-changing impact. Going back to what you were saying at the beginning about pretty much the way you decided to break down and sort of reframe the whole production chain of corn, which you then translated into your business model. I think that's exactly what I find so interesting about Masienda. It was so similar to the way that specialty coffee, like the whole industry now, it's operating in a very similar way, because you take heirloom corn, which is just a fancy word for calling the original varieties of Mexican corn, as a unique commodity. And then, just like, with small batch coffee beans, you will source this corn, like you said, from family farms in Mexico who are producing these micro crops, which you import for wholesale and to produce also your own tortillas. But I want to know, which process did you follow to refine the business model and go from, just the drawing board and actually make that idea work? And I'm also curious, which was Dan Barber's input into this really invested approach to it?
Yeah, well, I suppose we can start with Dan Barber just quickly to touch on it, which is that I was still working at Blue Hill, which is his restaurant, when I was putting this idea together. His input was one of just support, and I was really inspired by the work that I was doing at Blue Hill in the ethos of the type of work we were doing there, which was maximizing the pleasure that we get from food by being much more intentional about growing produce and vegetables and our relationship with the producers, and having that dialogue. I saw the benefits of that firsthand, of how extraordinary food could taste if there was just more of a connection directly to the source. So I think that process is really the gift that Dan gave to me and everybody who works at Blue Hill. Kind of going back to the first question specifically about the model. Tortilla was a really organic process. And I'm not saying that because, I'm making it sound like it was easy. No part of it was easy, but it was sort of one foot in front of the other. The process was unique, though, in the sense that no one had really attempted, from what I could tell, was this idea of scaling a micro supply chain. And yeah, coffee, absolutely. Coffee is it's a cash commodity crop. And corn in Mexico is not. Largely in the communities that we work in, it's a subsistence crop. So it's an enormous amount of responsibility that we don't take lightly. We're working with the food that is being produced for someone's home and for someone's family and for a community. Because if you have a surplus, you can't just assume that surplus is meant for the international market. You have to also really appreciate, there's a communal aspect to this, and that local tortillerias in a small town also should be surviving on this kind of corn and celebrating it. And I'd say that's the most stark contrast between coffee and corn, particularly heirloom corn that we work with. But yeah, I think it's having that kind of moment right now in corn, without a doubt. And it goes to the heart of connecting to the process, connecting to both the traditions and the agriculture. Telling that story to guests in restaurants was just as important. And that was just such a unique process that, again, it happened organically, bringing more people to an understanding and an appreciation of the culture behind it.
Now, going back to your answer, I think it is true what you say about the way Dan communicates the values of his company and his whole ethos. Speaks to this connection and this deep, almost philosophical and existential link to the care and the symbiosis of looking after the soil that nourishes. But I'm sure it resonated with you when you actually talked to farmers in Mexico and getting to know what the farming activity means for them in their daily lives. I have to say that I really appreciate and recognize the immense value and impact of what you are doing with and for Mexican farmers.
Thank you. We try really hard.
it doesn't go unnoticed. It makes me think that I'm sure it's a two-way learning curve. It's a very complex economic situation and very precarious as well for Mexican farmers. So like having a fast track to exporting, I'm sure is something exciting and also that raises many questions. So one of my questions is that how much will they have to rely on you to continue in business? Then it also makes me think, having so many immigrants that also were farmers back when they were living here, I think maybe introducing the milpa system into the US could potentially bring the same benefits because, they are the experts that are already working in the agro industry there. And just a quick note for those who are not that familiar with the term milpa, is the indigenous traditional crop system in Mexico that combines chiles, tomatoes, and sometimes courgettes to create a microecosystem that restores the nutrients back in the soil and creates an exchange of nutrients among the plants. But down to you.
Yeah. Wow, that's a lot. So you're absolutely right. There's this built-in cross-pollination that's literally and figuratively happening with migrant labor, and hopefully that continues. I'd say the goal now is to embrace regenerative agriculture, and that's what the milpa system is. It's a holistic system where each crop supports the other. That's why, to me, it's a no-brainer. Why not just kind of recreate that system, just like you're saying? But the times are changing, and consumers are changing so fast that, agriculture has to respond to those changes. And the milpa, more than anything, is a reflection of a sustainable way of eating. And I think as long as that ethos is becoming more of a part of our lives, and it certainly looks like that's becoming more and more a widespread phenomenon, the job of the milpa, it's come a long way. It's doing a great service to engendering other ways of eating and other types of cuisines. What we feel we have tried to create and promote is an open market. We pride ourselves on being a premium option and one that is very farmer-centric, taking into account their needs, the needs of a culture and our responsibility for doing our part within that ecosystem. To date, we are the only ones who have really been able to figure out how to successfully translate a product that is not commercialized, really, in the way we've come to understand it in the United States and internationally. Treat it with minimal interference, but create something that checks all the boxes and satisfies the needs of a larger market. So, to be able to translate and I think make sure that corn successfully reaches the end consumer, we do a really good job at that. The option is open for our farmers to sell to whomever they want. We can only just keep doing that work and hope that others are inclined to do the same and improve upon it. And, I think competition is a great thing.
And for you, I think it's in everybody's best interest to have a more robust market and, more partners to choose from,
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. All ships rise with the tide. All we can do is just make sure we're doing right by all of the stakeholders across the value chain and, do our best and do what we believe is right by, our mission and what we stand for.
Yeah. So something you were also mentioning was the way also both countries, Mexico and of course the US, understand tortillas. And, I have to admit, many urban dwellers in Mexico, if not most of them, we're not the kind of people that will make our tortillas by hand. Just as many people around the world won't make their bread at home. So we source our tortillas here in Mexico from tortillerias or tortilla shops. And those who are very lucky can get it from tortilla-making ladies, otherwise known as tortilleras, who are the ones who do pretty much what you do, be responsible for the whole field to tortilla process. So let's go back to the basics, and I'll let you explain step by step what happens between the moment you plant a kernel in the soil when you finally roll our tortillas to make a taco.
Oh my gosh. This is an incredibly complex process, and obviously it goes through many hands. In a very simple term, we call it the milpa to mesa process. It starts at the milpa, we'll say short for corn farm. In Oaxaca, we're talking about an area of about 5 hectares, maybe less than that. The corn has been hand planted, and it's not just any corn. This is corn that has been saved and improved upon for generations. In some cases, hundreds, thousands of years. Farmers are making a choice of what seeds they want to grow. The corn that they like best and functions best for them and for their family and for their culture and for their cuisine. And I think that's the most romantic thing at the end of the day. There's a very intentional process behind it, which I think is really important to articulate. They will plant it by hand. They will harvest it by hand. That is not an easy process. It is incredibly labor intensive. You have a basket on your back and you fill it up to as much as you can. And it's an enormous amount of work. It gets shelled by hand. So all of the kernels have to come off of the cob. And then for us, I'll just speak to Masienda's process. We really try to open up our aggregation as soon as possible after it's been harvested because there are no chemicals that are sprayed on this. We obviously pay the farmers right then and there. It's a significant piece to the model that we do. And we ship it to the United States. Everything is in the 55-pound bag, so about 25 kilos. When it gets to the end user, the work is not done. You need to nixtamalize the corn. Oh my gosh, it's one of the most phenomenal inventions, culinary innovations of all time. It was really what makes it nutritious. It's a process of soaking the corn in an alkaline solution, which allows it to break down the exterior hull of the corn, the pericarp. It allows it to be workable as a result into a masa. It's a corn alchemy process. And it takes about, let's say, 12 hours. You have to mill the corn with a volcanic rock. Is one of the oldest pieces of technology and still the best pieces of technology to do this. The step to making a tortilla, my gosh, it's months and months of work that goes into one tortilla. I wish more people knew how much work went into it without sounding boring, which I probably did.
No, you didn't. And of course, it only took native people from Mesoamerica about 9,000 years to refine this. It's like you say, it's paying tribute to this technique and this very, labor intense process. It works. You don't need to reinvent that in any other way that will alter or diminish the quality of the final product, right?
Right. Yeah, there's wisdom in the tradition. As a professor named Amanda Galvez that we work with has said, I think it's just finding how to use it in a modern context that's been really fun. And, Masienda's work is really largely entails.
Absolutely. And, Masienda has produced a few little films. I think it will be, very telling for people to, have a visual aid to all this wonderful process that you described and just to put a face on hundreds of people that are involved in all this production chain.
That would be great. We did it because it's an enormous amount of work that goes into it, but it's hopefully a good 90-second film to be able to explain the process and whet the appetite a little bit.
So I think, you are really sort of riding the wave of a great moment, I have to say, in the food industry, but also in the way people are, I would say, evolving their perceptions about food and understanding also traditional cuisines in a way that hadn't happened before. Well, now the social economy and social media has done a great job at glamorizing the idea of ethical businesses like yours, and also like how amazing it is to enjoy organic cocoa nibs on your quinoa salad while sipping a turmeric latte. There's more to it than glamour. But I would like you to share what it has been for you to work with micro farmers that come from these very tightly knit communities where agriculture and the way they do it has nothing to do with glamour, and it's really at the core of their lives, their identity. So what has that process taught you, and how you have reconveyed this message into your brand?
I think the values of the company have remained intact, but the way we describe our work and how we understand our work, because that's just as much of an important factor to consider. I think we've undersold it a lot because there's so much advertising of attributes and, there's just so much noise, and we try to produce content to be able to tell that story. I think that's been a unique experience for us in that when somebody really looks under the hood of our business and our value chain, they're pretty much blown away by the depth of work involved in it. It's not something that is easy to explain, right? It's a lot of information. And what information do you choose to share? Because it's not always going to be meaningful to everybody. There are some parts that'll resonate more with a chef and that won't resonate at all with a consumer at a supermarket. It's been a great exercise to understand what all of those perspectives are. And I think we're coming out of the other side now with a really firm sense of who we are and what we want to do more of. I think a lot of that really has to do with the education piece. Doing it in a way that doesn't feel preachy and doesn't feel branded, in a way that, frankly, it just speaks to the passion that we have about learning this ourselves and just sharing it.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I mean, there is so much use and abuse and about how honest businesses are. I understand the challenge to speaking to many different audiences, so you need to constantly produce messages that appeal to all of them. Educating and changing perspectives about having a better understanding. That sort of takes me to how are you introducing innovation to the food industry? So is that actually scalable, or are you always constricted to working in the micro or mid industry model?
Well, right now, I'd say the innovative thinking we apply to our business was just taking time to acknowledge that this ingredient had a history and to give it some meaning in a part of the world like the United States where it doesn't really have much meaning right now. It's a fun intellectual exercise when you see the potential that we have here to reclaim flavor and quality, owning more of the process and owning more of, our responsibility and being good stewards of the land. Really, it's just what we do and it's what we love to do. We're not introducing any crazy technologies here. It's just a different way of thinking about food that we eat and that we take for granted, I think, in its simplest way. And for some, that might be innovative. And for us, it's mostly just fun.
I think it's slowly changing. So like in America, many people are very familiar with Tex-Mex and Cali-Mex kind of food. And they're used to the type of tortillas that were available for decades. But just for the sake of argument, I want you to tell people what kind of experience is preparing their food using Masienda tortillas and how, in short, will make their lives better to use your tortillas. Come on, sell it.
This is the part of the interview I struggle with is selling ourselves. I mean, look, I think that at the end of the day, what we stand for is a connection to food. To me, that tastes better. When I know where something comes from, when I know that the people who are behind it are authentic and they're engaged. And if that resonates, Masienda is great. Is one of the options out there that I would definitely consider. Certainly the only option when it comes to tortillas.
Before we jump to the next thing, for the older folks that are in America, where can they find your tortillas?
Right. Are really just trying to deepen the education that we have around being able to process corn at home. So pretty soon when you come to masienda.com, you'll be able to get a lot more information on the steps to making and preparing nixtamal to make a really great tortilla. So that's incredibly fun. And I think anybody right now who lives in the U.S. can tap into that. We're launching a masa flour, so a masa harina. It's 100% the same supply chain that we have been working with and building over the last 5 years. We're super excited about it because I think it just speaks to everything we try to do in terms of fostering a connection to food. We're taking a more direct approach. So currently our tortillas are available in some of the Whole Foods in the country. I think that the internet is enabling us to do some pretty amazing things from customer service perspective. So you'll see a lot more products coming up on masienda.com that foster, the connection directly to consumer.
Brilliant. I understand that you are taking care of all this long process and having your eyes on pretty much all these threads that have to finish with your tortilla or with your bag of masa flour. What kind of feedback have you had from, everyday people? What has been the reaction?
People are incredibly excited. There's always, I think, the type of consumer who really gravitates to what we do. One of the most exciting things is when somebody who lives in the United States who hasn't been back home in Mexico for a while or who grew up in a Mexican household says how much this reminds them of food that their grandmother used to prepare. That's always, to me, the biggest compliment, a food memory that is really, really special, near and dear to them. And then, of course, chefs are so exciting to watch interact with the raw ingredient because just to see that creative process with chefs and how excited they are about the product, the trust that they put in us, there's a deep fulfillment from everybody that we work with,
I agree completely with you that the best kind of compliment you can get from someone is, of course, takes them back to that connection with the family, with the land, with good memories. And also for people who are not Mexican, just to sort of blow up their minds with amazing flavors they didn't know were just literally across the border. No?
Exactly.
Well, we're just finishing now the interview, but before we say our goodbyes, are there any events or some new twists in your range of products? And of course, please tell the audience all Masienda's social media accounts and ways of contacting you, contacting Masienda. Where can they follow? Please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks so much, Rocio. It was a pleasure to speak with you today. Anybody who has any cooking questions, sourcing questions, we're working on developing just kind of more expanded information on our site, but feel free to email us at info@masienda.com. That's pretty much my direct line if you want to email and get in touch with me. We're super excited to be able to launch a masa flour that has been in development now since the beginning. So our masa flour will be available directly on our site at masienda.com. You can create your tortilla destiny. Well, I'll put it that way with the masa flour.
Make it a hashtag.
Yes, exactly. You can just follow us at Masienda. So the words masa and tienda, Masienda, combined. So MASIENDA is our account, and that's really the only social media we kind of manage. We're much more one-on-one, like person-to-person communication in terms of our email and direct messaging on Instagram.
Great. Well, people will find you there. Jorge, thank you so much for sharing your story, your dreams, your work, and everything you are doing with Masienda. Keep building bridges and not walls between sun-kissed Mexican farms and American tables. Thank you for being here, and thank you again for your work, Jorge.
Thanks so much, Rocio. I appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening. This episode was written and produced by me, Rocio Carvajal. To find more information about this project, please go to pastachipotle.com. I really want to invite you to check this episode's blog post and YouTube version to continue enjoying loads of extra material about Masienda and the inspiring work that Jorge and his team are doing. And of course, as usual, you can find Masienda's social media links and website on this episode's notes. Support the show via Patreon. Patreon is the largest platform that connects independent creators with great audiences like you. Go to patreon.com/Chipotle Podcast. Every donation makes a big difference. Go to patreon.com/Chipotle Podcast and be part of this delicious story. In the next episode of the show, I will continue exploring the gastronomic regions of Mexico, and it will be all about the exuberant peninsula of Yucatan, the grand legacy of the Mayan culture, and the flavors and history of the Mexican Caribbean. Well, that's it for today, my friends. Until the next time.